There is a kind of silence that follows certain men like a second skin, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of someone who has absorbed more grief than any one life should hold and still chose, every single time, to walk out and sing. Roy Orbison was that man. Long before those dark glasses became one of the most recognized images in rock and roll history, and long before a 3-octave voice reduced concert halls full of strangers to absolute stillness, a quiet boy in a dusty West Texas town pressed a guitar against his chest like it was the only thing keeping him from disappearing entirely. What most people carry from Roy Orbison is the catalog, the hits they heard on the radio, the voice they cannot describe without running out of words. What very few people carry is the full weight of what that voice cost him. Because behind every song he ever recorded sat a grief so heavy it would have crushed anyone who hadn't decided early on that music was the only floor worth standing on. Vernon, Texas, on April 23, 1936, at 3:30 in the afternoon, was where Roy Kelton Orbison came into the world, right in the middle of the Dust Bowl tearing the land apart. His father, Orby Lee, worked oil wells and repaired engines in a garage, moving the family wherever the work demanded, and money stayed tight enough that every small luxury carried meaning. His mother, Nain Schultz Orbison, held the household together while the cracked landscape of Northwest Texas settled permanently into Roy's bones. That emptiness, the wide open quiet of a place with nothing soft in it, never left his sound, and anyone who ever felt something unexplainable while listening to Only the Lonely was actually feeling Vernon, Texas, without knowing it. 6 years old when he first asked for a harmonica, Roy got a guitar instead, and Orby taught him simple chords after the workday, finally wound down at night. That guitar stayed with him the way few things in his life ever would. By 8, he stood at a microphone at KVWC, the local Vernon radio station, delivering Hank Williams songs with a voice that already carried something that didn't belong to a child, and neighbors who caught those broadcasts started telling each other about the boy with the sound. Small coins came from those early performances, barely enough to cover school supplies. But in a house still dragging itself through the weight of the Depression, every coin counted as proof that something was happening. At 9, a radio contest gave him his own Saturday show, and somewhere around that time he wrote his first song, A Vow of Love, sitting outside his grandmother's house, pressing feelings onto paper before he fully understood what those feelings were. A 1946 talent contest tied to a traveling medicine show put Roy on stage against real competition, and he sang Mountain Dew and Joel Blonde well enough to tie for first place, splitting $15 with a friend who had carried his guitar the entire way. That split said everything about who he was before fame ever found his name. That same year, the Orbison family packed up and moved to Wink, Texas, following the oil fields that controlled their calendar, and Wink was a different kind of hard. Roy would later describe the town as football, oil fields, oil, grease, and sand, and that description captured the place completely, because there was nothing gentle about it and nothing to soften what the landscape pressed into a young boy's chest. Wink built the loneliness into him permanently, and at 13 he channeled it into forming his first band, the Wink Westerners, playing country music and swing at honky-tonks, and landing a weekly radio show in nearby Kermit. One dance paid him $400, enormous money for a Texas teenager in the 1940s, and each gig pushed his belief a little further towards certainty. Grief found him early, though, because in 1953, when Roy was 17, his mother Nain died without warning from a respiratory illness, and the loss collapsed something inside him that never fully rebuilt. Wink already felt like the edge of the known world, and now the person who had anchored his home was simply gone. Late evenings pumping gas helped support his father, while Roy loaded every hurt he couldn't speak into the music he kept writing, and that grief became the engine that powered his entire artistic voice, the deep emotional reservoir that no other singer of his generation could tap in quite the same way. North Texas State College came in 1954, geology as a backup plan, but geology had no chance against a man who had already decided what he was. Roy switched to history and English, kept playing with college friends, and recorded Yubi Doobie at a Dallas studio in 1955, chasing the rockabilly sound coming out of Sun Records with everything he had. When the song broke locally, he left college, formed the Team Kings, won a talent show that handed them a television deal, and started working toward Memphis with real hunger behind him. A record store owner named Papa Holyfield played Yubi Doobie over the phone to Sam Phillips, and that phone call got the Team Kings an audition at Sun Records in April of 1956. They re-recorded the song, and within months, it climbed to number 59 on the Billboard Hot 100, moving around 200,000 copies, and Roy tasted national attention for the first time. Sun Records broke down fast, though, because Roy wanted ballads, heavy and emotional, and Sam Phillips wanted rockabilly that could make teenagers dance. Those two visions had no middle ground, and by late 1956 the Team Kings had splintered apart, and Roy had walked out after 7 months, carrying disputes over royalties and a frustration that nearly broke his nerve entirely. For a moment, the oil fields looked like the realistic option. What pulled him back was a song he had written for his wife Claudette, which landed as the B-side to the Everly Brothers hit All I Have to Do Is Dream and reached number 30 in 1959. The royalties bought a pink Cadillac that he burned through too quickly, and then the money was gone, and he was back in Wink living with his parents, wondering if the window had already closed. Acuff Rose in Nashville came next, with Wesley Rose genuinely believing in his songwriting, helping him buy out his Sun contract, and getting him on stage opening for Johnny Cash at the Grand Ole Opry. A manager stealing money from their tours tore that chapter apart and sent Roy back to Nashville with nearly nothing, recording demos just to cover his own living expenses. None of that mattered in the end, because Monument Records was waiting. Fred Foster heard something in Roy when he walked into Monument in 1959, and the song that proved it was Only the Lonely, released in May of 1960. Number 2 in the United States, and then across the Atlantic to number 1 in the United Kingdom, where it stayed on the charts for 24 weeks straight and sold over 1 million copies in America alone. What Roy Orbison built in that studio, those soaring string arrangements, the rising crescendos, the falsetto that seemed to exist outside the range of ordinary human anatomy, set a bar that nobody else in pop music had approached. The Beatles absorbed the architecture of those songs. The Beach Boys studied the emotional builds. Listeners felt something before they could identify it, the way you feel weather before you can name it, and Roy Orbison had invented a sound that belonged to him alone. The dark glasses became permanent almost entirely by accident, because in 1963 he arrived at a show without his prescription pair and wore his outdoor sunglasses instead, and the audience responded to the mystery of it so strongly that he never took them off again. Combined with the way he performed, standing completely still in black while his voice filled every corner of the room, Roy created one of the most distinctive stage presences rock and roll has ever produced. Other performers shook and moved and worked the crowd physically, but Roy simply stood there and let the voice do everything, and the rooms leaned forward every time. Blue Angel reached number 9 in 1961, and Crying hit number 1 on the Cashbox chart in October of that year, selling over 8 million copies before eventually landing at number 69 on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Songs of All Time list in 2010. A Grammy Hall of Fame award came for that song in 2002, and the Spanish guitar solo on the track shaped an entire generation of musicians who came after. The 1963 British tour put Roy at the top of a bill that featured the Beatles as his opening act, 17 dates across England, Wales, and Scotland starting May 18th and ending June 9th in Blackburn, and Roy so thoroughly destroyed those audiences night after night that promoters eventually made the Beatles co-headliners just to keep things commercially balanced. John Lennon put it plainly, calling Roy the greatest singer in the world, and Ringo Starr admitted it was terrible having to follow him on stage because Roy would slay the crowd completely and leave nothing standing. It's Over came out in 1964 and hit number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 while reaching number 1 in the UK, where it stayed at the top for 2 weeks inside an 18-week chart run, and Roy recorded the whole thing in a single take right after an argument with Claudette, with the raw emotion shaking the room so completely that producer Fred Foster and engineer Bill Porter knew immediately they had something. Then came Oh Pretty Woman, written with Bill Dees in about 40 minutes at Roy's home on July 24, 1964, after Claudette said she was heading out and Dees joked that a pretty woman never needs money. Roy sang the opening line on the spot. Recorded August 1st at RCA Studio B in Nashville, The song hit #1 in both the US and the UK in September of 1964, sold more than 7 million copies, became his second #1 single, and landed as one of the defining songs of the entire decade. Some radio stations initially refused to play it because the bass riff sounded too sexual to them, and none of that slowed it down by a single day. Behind all of that rising success, his marriage to Claudette was fracturing under the weight of constant touring and the loneliness that distance produces. She had an affair while Roy was away. They divorced in November 1964, and within 10 months they had remarried and were trying to rebuild something the road had cracked. Then on June 6, 1966, near Gallatin, Tennessee, they were riding motorcycles together when a pickup truck pulled out and threw Claudette from her bike. She died an hour later, 24 years old, and Roy held her as she went. Shows were canceled for months. He buried her in Hendersonville and tried to find a way to breathe inside a world that had become unrecognizable. 2 years later, what happened next was simply beyond the limits of what any one person should have to absorb. September 14, 1968, while Roy toured England, a fire tore through his Hendersonville home, and his sons Roy Dwayne, aged 10, and Anthony, aged 6, died in their sleep before anyone could reach them. Wesley, just 3 years old, survived because his grandparents pulled him out in time. Roy received the news from across the ocean and broke in a way that his music would quietly carry for the rest of his life. Johnny Cash later bought the property and planted an orchard across the ashes, telling Roy that only good things would grow there now. And that gesture became one of the most human moments in the entire history of popular music. Barry Gibb eventually built a home on that land in 2008, but the memory stayed carved into the soil and into Roy permanently. Chain smoking followed, sometimes 2 full packs a day, and the ulcers that had troubled him since 1960 grew significantly worse. Doctors warned him repeatedly that stress and cigarettes were dismantling him from the inside, and Roy heard every warning and kept performing anyway because the stage was the only floor that still felt solid. His 1965 move to MGM for a $1 million deal had already complicated things, demanding 3 full albums per year and burying him under production pressure that produced over 70 songs in his first year alone. The British invasion had rewritten American radio overnight, and while his debut MGM album reached #1 in Canada and the UK, America barely noticed, with only 3 songs reaching the US Top 40 across his entire MGM period. He headlined 20 shows across Australia in just 14 days in January 1967, performed 2 shows at Sydney Stadium in a single day, and carried Claudette's death through every one of those performances with jet lag and grief draining his voice to the point where reviewers called him hoarse and tired. Walk On in 1968 was buried under MGM4 string arrangements that drowned everything pure about his delivery, reaching number 53 in Australia, 39 in the UK, and only number 121 in America, becoming a symbol of how often his actual artistic instincts were overruled by label decisions. March 25, 1969 brought his marriage to Barbara Jacobs in Nashville, 19 years old, and the press treated the wedding as tabloid material while Roy held on to her simply because she brought light back into a life that had run out of it. 2 sons followed, Roy Kelton Jr. and Alexander, and he protected that new family with everything he had left. Late 1977, sharp chest pains during a Hawaii vacation led doctors to find severe coronary artery disease, and on January 18, 1978, triple bypass surgery took 20 pounds off him and kept him out of commission for months. He returned to performing before doctors cleared him, because staying still was something he had never learned to do. A Canadian tour bus accident in 1979 brought a severe infection and another round of medical warnings that continuing to tour could kill him, and he adjusted his schedule slightly and kept going regardless. The 1980 album Laminar Flow, full of synthesizers and atmospheric sounds that confused everyone at the time, would eventually earn a small devoted following decades later, with listeners comparing certain tracks to early Depeche Mode and the Human League, proof that Roy was often ahead of the moment he was living in. That changed completely in 1988, when George Harrison needed to record a B-side and called in a handful of friends who ended up making something nobody planned. Roy Orbison, Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, and Jeff Lynne walked into a studio together almost casually, And what came out of those sessions was the Traveling Wilburys, Volume 1. Roy took the name Lefty Wilbury and delivered harmonies that reminded the world exactly what it had been missing. Handle with Care reached the top 50, and the album sold over 2 million copies, introducing Roy to a generation that had grown up after his peak years and letting older listeners rediscover him with completely fresh ears. Mystery Girl followed immediately, recorded while Roy was already feeling the chest pains that those around him begged him to address. And the album Produced You Got It, which climbed to number 9 on the Billboard chart, his highest single position since 1964. The full album reached number 5 in the United States and number 2 in the UK, selling over 3 million copies worldwide. December 6, 1988, Roy Orbison collapsed at his Nashville home at 52 years old after spending the day laughing and flying remote control airplanes with his sons. Doctors could not revive him. The autopsy found blockages that had been building quietly for years, constructing and ending while Roy was in the middle of one of the greatest second acts any artist had ever managed to produce. Mystery Girl came out weeks later and earned him a posthumous Grammy, and he became the first artist since Elvis Presley to place 2 albums simultaneously in the top 5 after death. Barbara protected his catalog with the dedication of someone who fully understood what she was holding, and in 2018, she produced a hologram performance built from more than 200,000 individually hand-touched frames. His sons launched the Roy Orbison Legacy Tour in 2019, bringing his voice and image back to stages across America, the United Kingdom, and Europe, letting audiences feel something that should have been impossible to feel again. Some voices are built for a single decade, and some are built for every moment when human beings need to feel something real, and the voice of Roy Orbison has always belonged firmly in the second group.